welcome everybody to this month's film club discussion. We're here to talk about Germans and Jews, and we're very pleased to be joined by the film's director, Janina Quint. So thank you so much for joining us. I will start just by offering my my 2P, as we say here, or 2 cents, as you would say. I feel I really love this film, first of all. I feel like my background is as a Holocaust educator. And for a lot of what I've done, you always have to sort of think about, well, where do you start telling the story? How far back do you rewind? And often I would, if I had enough time, say, I think let's go back in Germany, at least, to the age of the Enlightenment, to Moses Mendelssohn, when these questions about the tension between Germanness and Jewishness really came to the forefront. And a lot of Jews were asking themselves, to what extent can I be both German and Jewish? And many non-Jewish Germans were asking that question about their fellow citizens who were Jews. And then you sort of work your way, you fast forward to the Holocaust. You know, it's important to tell students that, you know, the Nazis didn't invent this idea that, you know, you couldn't be both German and Jewish at the same time. And it's also important to say that that debate, that tension didn't end with the Holocaust. And that's why I think this film is such an important contribution to this discussion. It reminds us that, yes, the Holocaust was this huge rift, obviously, in Jewish life in Germany, as we all know. But that story continues, and that debate continues to today. And like so many great documentaries, I thought that this one asked more questions than it answered. And so I want to thank you for that. I want to hear about, how did you come to this topic? What was the inspiration for it?
There's many factors. I mean, the spark was my friend Tal. We've been friends for 35 years, and she's American Jewish, and did this trip to Berlin. It's called, like, I don't know, I think maybe Jewish Berlin. It's like she had a tour guide who's also in our film, this guy Torsten. Mm-hmm. And she came back to New York and said, you know, my mind is blown away. I did not understand to what extent this process actually happened in Germany. I want to do something about Jews in Germany, and I'm her German friend. I've been living in New York for, I don't know, since '86. My husband is Jewish, so I think for me this German Jewish thing is sort of at this point in my DNA. But as a German, I was always aware what was going on, but I'm not the one to tell the story. You know, look what we've done. You know, it's sort of more like you keep quiet, you do what you have to do. But she was the one who then said, we need to document this in some way. And then we started filming, not really know where this film was going. But it's really through the interviews that we then thought, this is the structure, this is the story we want to tell. We want to say, you know, how it happened. It's a historical film, really tracing 1945 to 2015. And I think also it's interesting you show the film now, because I think if we did the film today, we would add a few chapters.
Absolutely. I thought I would, in my questions that I had written out, I thought we would end with that topic, but actually now that you raise it now, let's just get into that. I mean, it is very interesting. I mean, obviously, just last week we had another election. There's interesting things to discuss about what the AFD, the far right party lost some seats, but there's still a political force to be dealt with in Germany that still exists. I think that there's, many of our members and their, certainly our first generation members and their children and grandchildren are now dealing with the possibility in the aftermath of Brexit that many descendants of German Jews are now applying for German citizenship. I know
Here too, by the way.
Okay.
And
I know you talked about some of in the film about Israelis who were getting German, and this is sort of a related topic to that, I suppose. So if you were, I am curious to hear, if you were making the film today, do you think it would be the same film, or would the discussion be even more kind of complex than it already is? What's your take on that?
I think it would be more complex because you would obviously have to talk a little about the AFD. You cannot ignore that. And you would even make the chapter on Eastern Germany, I think, bigger, because I think I'm a huge believer in education. And I think actually the last election even confirms that even, the situation in West Germany is by no means perfect, but you see a very clear divide where the AfD comes from mostly. You look at the map, Thüringen and Sachsen, this is where their stronghold is. That's the former East Germany. And this is also the area where you have the least immigrants, which is sort of the irony of it all. They don't even have immigrants because it was already known you don't want to go there if you are of Turkish or descent, or Black or Muslim or Jewish. You just. So I think it's complex. And then you have also this phenomenon of anti-Semitism in Germany from the Muslim base, which is crazy because I talked to a Jewish community in Hanover, and we had people voting for the AfD because they felt, I'm safer with the AfD because we feel threatened by the Muslims. So it is a very complex situation, and anti-Semitism will never go away. I think it'll always be there, but it has to do with how does the state very much, I think, deal with it, and education and so forth.
It's fascinating. The point that you raised about when you're going through the sort of the progression, historical progression, over the past, 75 years or whatever, and talking about how basically there are these two parallel paths of East and West Germany. And I thought that was a really fascinating point, these divergent narratives. And then they had to come together and sort of find the things that they did and didn't necessarily sort of culturally see eye to eye on. And the sort of the Jewish question, so to speak, and the Nazi question was, were at the forefront of that. One of the, I don't know if this is exactly a critique of the film, but I suppose the film, it can only cover what it covers. But I did find it noteworthy that while the film is called Germans and Jews, really it was probably mostly Berliners and Jews. It was a very Berlin-centric film. Is that something that you would agree with? Do you feel like if you had more time or resources, you might have expanded it wider, and would it have told a different story?
Well, it is and it isn't, because obviously, yes, but Berlin was also the center of, of the Third Reich. It has been the center. If you go back to Moses Mendelssohn, those discussions started in Berlin. It was the center where, the city was divided during the Cold War. But the process, of memorial building and the grassroots organizations that dug in their local history, that did indeed happen all over Germany. It's not by no means a Berlin phenomenon. You have the biggest monuments there because it's a political center and it has a lot of money, but you have in many little towns, you have the local historian, which is also this German phenomenon that you have local historians that lead groups of a certain generation, they felt they wanted to undo what the parents and grandparents had covered up. And that is a pretty, I wouldn't, so I think the arc of what happened in Germany between 45 to 2015, the overall arc is true for the country.
I see what you're saying. I suppose what brought that to mind was, when you talked about these sort of like hip young Israelis, who are moving there, it occurred to me they probably, weren't moving to just anywhere in Germany. They were specifically moving to Berlin because, as you point out, it's got this sort of very thriving cultural scene there and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but none of us, I assume you and me were the same. We wouldn't move. I mean, I wouldn't even move to New Jersey.
I hear you. I haven't moved to Berlin, but I would move there in a second. I love it.
But you're in London,
I might not say that about other places in Germany.
New York, it's always, there are these more cosmopolitan cities are different, obviously.
Yeah.
But I also for example, when the Russian immigration happened, they were dispersed all over Germany. So this was called, right. They wanted to do this. Of course, then the next generation, they all moved to Berlin and Munich and Frankfurt.
Right, exactly. And I think that, because you talked about how, and this is such an important point, that, Germany has the fastest growing Jewish population in Europe, and it's now got 200,000, and this was 5 years ago. So I don't even know the numbers right now, but presumably it's maybe even a bit higher than that. And a large number of that, the Jews from the former Soviet Union make up a large number of that. But as you point out, it's not all of them. It's other people who just feel like Germany is a more welcoming place than, their previous generations would have assumed.
The largest number by far is the Russians. And, right. And there was and that also, suddenly you had a critical mass that you could develop Jewish communities. Right. With different options between reform or conservative, because all this was so small before. So that was the critical mass by all accounts.
That one Israeli musician, the drummer, who I thought was a very interesting person generally, he talked about his mother. I wrote down the quote. He said, she had this repulsion adoration thing, Auschwitz and Mercedes. And that was such a memorable line. I wonder of our members who are here today, if you want to drop a comment in the chat or anything at this point, if that's something that resonates with either you or people in your family. I would be very interested to hear your views on that, this repulsion adoration thing. I know that for many of our members, particularly those who emigrated to the UK before, in the 1930s, before the war, they kept that sort of that pride, that cosmopolitan, often, in this case, we're talking about Berlin, so it's a sort of very Berliner pride, but also, Viennese pride. And it was very much part of their identity, but trying to square that with what they know that same culture was capable of is obviously such a personal point of conflict for many people. Eva Clark says, very much so, exclamation mark. Thank you, Eva, for weighing in on that. I thought that was such, I'm really glad that you included that point from the musician in there. Shifting from the Jewish perspective to the German perspective. So you talked about a few key sort of cultural turning points. It was very interesting how you talked about the 1968 student movement being a particular cultural turning point, about the Holocaust television miniseries being shown in Germany being a cultural turning point, and that you said it was the first time that a lot of people started asking some difficult questions about their parents and their grandparents. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I found that really interesting.
Well, the whole thing, how this was even shown, the Holocaust series, there was a lot of resistance at some point, because people said, how can you, and the resistance from the left also saying, this is not a Hollywood production, it's not giving justice. You cannot even begin to shape what happened in a Hollywood movie, you know? And they were like, so, and then somebody just said, I don't know, it was shown in some other country. And then the consensus came, okay, if they're showing something, we have to do it too. And then it became this overwhelming success where I listened to some of the debates later after the program. There were these TV discussions that were recorded. And it was like a huge, huge success in starting a debate. I remember even my teacher at the time, he alerted us and said, you know, this is going to be shown, you should watch it. I think my dad was traveling, and I said to my mom, let's watch it. She didn't want to watch it. She has this, you know, she's educated, she read a lot. She also felt this is Hollywood. What can you learn from this? And maybe she also felt, you know, uncomfortable. What will I discover? What about my parents? I don't know. She passed away. I would have liked to talk to her about this now.
It's fascinating because I mean, I've known that film was a cultural turning point, you know, certainly in America, in Britain, in places like that. I don't think I really knew that it was quite as much of a cultural turning point in Germany, introducing Germans to their own history. These days, in the world of Holocaust education, Germany is really at the forefront. I mean, you would be hard pressed to find, you know, a German who's been educated in the last generation who isn't very well informed about their country's own crimes. But the idea that in the 1970s, you know, there was a whole generation or more of Germans who really didn't know about their own history is quite remarkable. And that it took...
But listen, a lot of people knew, you could smell that something bad happened, but that's still not really, doesn't mean you're able to confront it, you know?
Right.
And I think I'm not surprised that it took a while, because it's a generational thing. It's a very hard thing, as Thorsten also says in the film, to really say, gee, my father committed huge atrocities, possibly, or my grandfather, people that you love, you're emotionally close, and also have this unspoken loyalty because they're your family. So I'm not surprised that it takes time. You know,
absolutely. I think as you or someone in the film pointed out, this doesn't happen with the flip of a switch. You know, someone used the metaphor of a large, you know, a tanker ship or something like that. You know, it's these changes, you sort of slightly change direction.
Yeah, because it's huge. It's so big. It's what happened there. You absolutely can still not really put it in words, and it's so complex that yeah.
I just want to read a few of the comments that are in the chat here. One of our members, Joan Pollock, says, I don't think Germany has confronted its anti-Semitism effectively. There are no survivors there, I think. So it is interesting to say that, you know, this population of Jews tended to not be survivors of the Holocaust. Maybe, you know, they're family members, but I think that's probably a good point, that not very many survivors would have actually gone back to Germany after the war. Maybe some, but not as
some, but the few, I mean, even there's quite a, now less so, but until I would say 5-10 years ago, there were quite a few programs where people were invited back, even from the States, to talk locally, again, in these little towns, these historians. And I've met a few here in New York, actually. because they do believe, you need the person, the individual stories. That's the most interesting one. So
Right.
if people are open, they have been invited, but then also there were people who stayed not by choice, but they were in these stateless, these camps, and they tried to go to the US, or they tried to go to Canada, and they couldn't get exit visas, and they kept quiet in Germany because the whole country was quiet. They weren't. It's very hard to speak up if you're surrounded by ex-Nazis and try to educate them.
Yeah. Well, a few other comments here. Cheryl says much of the silence came from survivors themselves. In the UK, people started to become aware during the 1960s, which I think is true. I do want, I mean, in a country like Germany, I don't think it was necessary, I suppose, for survivors to be the ones to tell the story, because the story was everywhere. But I mean, it is an interesting point that there was that silence wasn't just on the part of the perpetrator nation. There was a lot of people around the world who had a lot of different ways of being involved in this episode of history, weren't talking about it for some time. So that's a very good point.
I mean, for example, there is this guy Bauer.
Yehuda Bauer.
What?
Was it Yehuda Bauer?
Was it Yehuda? He was a big element to bring the Auschwitz trial.
Okay.
Yes, he survived, a Jewish survivor in Sweden, I think.
Okay,
he came back to Germany, and he was one of those few Jewish people who really tried, and it was very hard for him.
I can only imagine. I mean at that time, yeah. Eva says hardly any World War II history was taught in East German schools or anywhere in communist Europe, which is interesting. And when it was taught, as I think they point out in the film, it was very much about the triumph of communism over fascism in broad terms, but the sort of the specific, certainly specifics of the genocide against Jews that we now call the Holocaust, that was not really the emphasis, was it?
Because they felt, look, the communists were persecuted by the Nazis. So by definition, if you're then in East Germany, it's communist. If anything, we're victims of the Nazis, and they put themselves in the same category. And we have, never mind that my father was in the SS. It was kind of washed away.
Mark writes, my wife, a 62-year-old German who grew up in Germany, told me that she was inundated with Holocaust history in school. She almost resents that, especially when she considers that Austrian schools have never mentioned a word about it. Well, Austrian schools do cover it now, but I accept the point that, of your wife's generation, that it might have been seen as, as being quite a different thing in Austria. It is worth noting that Austria took a much longer time to accept its own sort of status as a perpetrator, collaborator nation. It was only very recently, when there were still sort of official narratives from Austria that were, referred to Austria as being, the first victim of Nazi, of Nazism.
I mean, historically, we know they were a very enthusiastic collaborator.
Exactly. By the way, if you're looking to do a sequel, Austrians and Jews, that would be a fascinating one, I think. Can't imagine that you want to restart that process all over again, but should you? I think that's a whole other story worth telling. Just to say, I'm just looking here at some of the the other thing, just going back to the sort of cultural turning points, you spent a lot of time looking at this sort of more recent culture of memorialization, and it is noteworthy that that Germany, and I've taken groups of teachers to study about, how to teach about the Holocaust multiple times to Berlin. And, there are, as you point out, memorials everywhere. There's, sort of specific memorials to, handicapped victims or gay victims. And then there's more general, memorials to certain types of crimes. There's the topography of terror that looks at the perpetrator perspective. There's Grunwald Station that looks at the sort of the perspective of Jewish deportees. It really is everywhere. And this is just in Berlin. And the Stolpersteiner project, which is literally underfoot almost anywhere you go now, all across Europe. I'm curious, what's your take from, from having, interviewed, the people that you've interviewed, or from your own perspective about this culture of memorialization? Do you feel like, is Germany getting it about right? Is it over the top? Is it, creating some sort of a culture of shame? What do you make of that?
We will see how future generations deal with it. It's a complicated. It was on the forefront from a certain generation, but we don't, at some point, people will maybe, I don't know, they just tune it out. It's like other things in the city. It becomes this meaningless, I'm trying to say, it's not going to have that educational component anymore. Maybe for some, maybe for others not.
I'm curious to know from our members who are on this Zoom, have you visited any of these memorials? And if so, what do you make of them? I would be very, it's easy for me to sort of intellectualize some of these things, but of course, some of the people on this call have a much more personal and direct history with it. Yeah, I'm curious to hear about that. If you have views, please do chime in.
Also, another factor is, like, at this point, Germany, 20% of Germans have some kind of a migrating background, which is crazy because when I grew up there, that didn't exist. Okay, so in a relative short time, 20% is quite large.
Oh, absolutely, and it's really interesting.
How do these people then identify with these things? How relevant is that for people who have no roots in this? I mean, this is a bit, I can relate this to the US, where we have, we have voices now. We should some reparations on slavery, but then we have the Irish, the Italians, that came, they say, what the fuck, it's not my business,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could imagine a 16-year-old child, German from a Turkish family studying about the Holocaust. This was not their crime. It's like, they're German, but
from their social media, they get pretty strong anti-Semitic messages anyway. So
sure, I mean, and there are different strands of anti-Semitism. There's far-right anti-Semitism, there's far-left anti-Semitism, there's Islamist anti-Semitism, and of course, we don't want to. They all share common traits, but of course, we have a huge Muslim population in Germany now. They're not all anti-Semitic, but of course they're, you can only imagine the confused messages that young people or new arrivals in the country must be getting about this sort of this on the one hand feeling like this country needs to embrace its past and its crimes and accept them, warts and all. On the other hand, this wasn't their country at the time, so it's fascinating. But there were many people interviewed in the film who were Germans, who came from German families, who were in Germany at the time of the Holocaust, who acknowledged that their parents or grandparents were involved in some way or another. And that's a very complex thing in its own right. And there was this question that came up of, to what extent are young Germans today allowed to be patriotic? Is it acceptable to feel, you know, proudly German? And I just thought hearing them grappling with that was fascinating. The one man whose name I forget, he said, well, I do feel German, but in the sort of sense of like embracing human rights and these like very liberal modern German values, which is like, well, you would hope he would be proud of that sort of thing.
Yeah, but again, you know, it's when you in the beginning we said sort of what would we add in the if we did the film today. I forgot one crucial thing, and that's social media, because that really, when we did the film, it didn't have yet such a political force the way it was used also in this country to spit out lies and radicalize people in all kinds of directions. I think it's really something that became prevalent really in the last 5, 6, 7 years. A whole force of itself. And the problem with social media is that you cannot, there's no complexity. It's always black and white. It's very divisive. You don't get attention if you explain something in 10 sentences. You only get a headline.
Absolutely. And the thing, you know,
that's the real problem. I think that's the real problem, I think, actually for all democracies.
I totally agree. I mean, I'm someone who, you know, I care very much about issues, nuanced issues about identity and things like that. I'm also on social media quite a bit, and those two things don't work together. When you're trying to deal with nuance and complexity, social media is the wrong platform. But of course, that's where so much discourse exists today. So what do we do with that? I don't know. Just to read a few more comments here. Vivian says, my father was incarcerated in a prison in Dresden. There's a monument outside which mentions all the nationalities who suffered under Nazism, but nothing about Jews. Definitely something of a particular time when, you know, the sort of the Holocaust was sort of de-Jewified, different time and place.
From when is this plaque? Because Dresden obviously is East Germany. It'd be interesting to know when this plaque was put on.
That would be my assumption, is that it would have been a communist era plaque, but I don't know, Vivian, if you know any more about it. Jones, all right, here's an interesting comment about the film. Jones says, what gets me is that I don't hear any apologies from the Germans on the film. I mean, to specifically say that they are hurt and embarrassed by their family's behavior towards Jews. It's a good point. I mean, there's this sort of general sense of discomfort, but no actual apologies. And I suppose the question I would say back to Joan is, you know, do they have to apologize? Is it for them to apologize for their parents or grandparents? I know I certainly don't want to have to apologize for my parents or grandparents. They clearly weren't Nazis, but I don't know if it's my role to do that on their behalf for anything they ever did wrong. What was there any, you know, when you were filming, was there anything in your footage that was left on the cutting room floor that was like an apology?
I mean, our guy, Torsten, he says, my grandfather was part of the SS.
True.
And he wasn't by his own free will. And then I think if the fact that then Torsten becomes a history and Holocaust educator, I think speaks volumes. You know, he's trying to grapple with that, but instead of just saying something, he's doing something. He's dedicating his life to understanding this.
Thank you. There's so many comments. By the way, Joan, who had asked that last question or made that last comment, has had to log off because she had another commitment. But she did say, just to say, she would never visit Germany. She doesn't need to justify her existence by it's one particular viewpoint, isn't it? You know.
No, but I completely understand that. Yeah. I completely understand that you don't want to go there. I mean, you don't have to explain anything.
No, I agree. And that's, I think I think that must be part of the reason why you wanted to make this film. It's like you have such, it's like you have that viewpoint on the one hand, and then you have the young, hip Israelis who are moving there and, enjoying this, cultural renaissance or whatever.
Yeah.
And everything in between. Eva writes, there's a memorial park just outside the gates of Mauthausen, her birthplace. So Eva Clark is, she was born in Mauthausen one day before the liberation. So as she says, she's a Holocaust survivor, but just. This consists of sculptures created by artists from each country that had prisoners incarcerated there. It's very moving, also heartrending. Also heartrending is the memorial about 77,000 victims' names in the Pincus Synagogue in Prague. I agree, Eva, with that. And this is all part of this sort of culture of remembrance. It was very interesting and pertinent to something going on here in the UK, Janina, that you might not be aware of, but there's this proposal for a big Holocaust memorial in Westminster, right next to the Houses of Parliament. And one of the people in the film said when they were first proposing the gigantic memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which takes up an entire city block in Berlin, one person said, well, I was worried that, politicians were going to use it to, bring visiting dignitaries here and say, look at how good Germany is remembering our past. And that's almost the exact same thing that people say in Britain, critics say in Britain about the proposed memorial here. Mind you, we're not a perpetrator country, but we do have our own complex and sometimes difficult history here. And it's interesting that it seems like, I say this without any agenda. I happen to be a supporter of the Holocaust Memorial in Westminster, but that the fears that that what it might, what the meaning of it might be when it was first proposed turned out to not necessarily be the case, because the memorials sometimes take on a life of their own, that the culture applies its own meaning to them, regardless of what the official intention of it might have been. And so it's fascinating to see how that memorial has become such a centerpiece of I hesitate to say, but the tourist culture of Berlin now. Let's see, comment here from Mark.
Interesting, you mentioned.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned, of course, the British were not perpetrators, but we tried to interview a lady. She's probably died by now. She's a prominent survivor in Berlin. She survived in Berlin in some basement, and then subsequently educated in the schools and blah, blah, blah. And we said we were an American production. And she said, I don't want to have anything to do with the Americans. They knew where the tracks to Auschwitz were for years. They could have just bombed them. Why didn't you do anything? Yep. I was like shocked. I was shocked. She was so principled. She's like, that's not for me. It's bullshit.
Okay.
The Allies knew what they could have done. I mean, not trying to take anything away.
No. I think that all of these points that are being raised just highlight the complexity of the situation and why I feel like this film was so important. And this is how skillfully you touched on so many different perspectives. As I said at the outset, kind of complicating our thinking in a good way, not arriving at convenient, tidy little answers, because there really isn't one. No. Just to give a counterpoint to what Joan had said a minute ago, Mark says, I'm the exception here because although my father was a German Jew and lost some 20 family members murdered in the Holocaust, I was born and grew up in Canada and only learned my dad was Jewish in 1996, 17 years after his death. I've visited Germany many times, both for business and pleasure, and have recovered German citizenship, as we discussed earlier. I cannot blame my German friends for the Holocaust, and for the most part, they acknowledge the involvement and guilt of the previous generation. So I understand the German attitudes in the film. Thanks very much for making it, Janina, he says. So, emphasizing that point. it's just so much to take in, so much to think about. To everyone who's writing these fascinating comments, I just wanted to say we have a small enough group that I'm more than happy to open up the microphones if anyone has a question that they want to ask of Janina while we have her here. Is there anyone who has something that they would like to ask about the film or the issues that it raises? Any hands? No? Okay. Just wanted to give you that opportunity. I think that's all. If there's no questions from our audience, I would say I think we've covered. Oh, okay. Sorry, it's coming up here in the chat here. Mark says, "Why did you decide to make the film?" I think we said that at the outset about your own background. Is there anything more that, to be said?
Yeah, I didn't really want to, but Tal really persisted. I've done some films in the past, documentaries on philosophy and some more experimental things, and she really, I think for over a year, she sort of said, you got to do something, and then I thought, yeah, looking at my background, and I think I made it actually for our children, having this Jewish father and German mother. We talk about it at home, and I felt this is an opportunity for me. I must do the film, actually.
And tell me about, so we had hoped that Tal, who's the executive producer, might be able to join us on this Zoom as well, and she wasn't able to. Why was she so insistent on it? What's her connection?
She is obsessed with the Holocaust.
Okay.
Her mother was a Romanian Jew that luckily, just Romania was not, Hitler didn't start deporting Romania yet. So they were lucky, they survived. Then the Russians came, they survived in a DP camp outside Vienna. And I think I don't know, more through the mother than her father, this was very much part of her upbringing. And she, to this day, she's sort of this private historian and the Holocaust. And I think I was her first German friend. So it's a very deep friendship, but it is because maybe my background, it has this other layer. It's not just any friendship. There is this.
Right. That's very interesting. I had one question. That dinner party in the film, that's sort of like the centerpiece, so to speak, of it. Was that something that you put together, or was that like a group of people who were meeting independently?
Actually, we had a dinner. This was Suzanne, a friend of mine. We had this dinner on one of our trips with only with some of those people. And then we said, hey, you know what? Why don't we just do it the dinner, schedule a dinner and make it part of the film.
Very good.
This is spontaneous. And then of course we invited people, and we also wanted to make sure we have people of sort of the same generation, like our generation, Tal's and my generation.
Got it.
Because yes, the film is really about the generations after. That's sort of the emphasis.
We have a question here from Cheryl. Cheryl, you're gonna need to unmute yourself if you can.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for the film. I found it very, very interesting. And I just wanted to say, from my perception, having been to Germany a lot, because I worked in the film industry in a lot of places around Europe. And oh my word, I had it very much pigeonholed, but I had to rethink quite a lot. And talking about whether second generation, if they should feel guilty for what happened, I think they do. I mean, certainly, I've met grown men who sat down on the floor and cried and said, "I'm so ashamed of what my father or grandparents did, and I'm so ashamed of being German." And I thought that was an interesting point that it came up, that most Germans don't say they're German, but for me, I gotta say, other countries made me feel just as bad as being Jewish, like Romania. Oh my word. But also, whereas on one side, I met this man, as I said, who sat down and just cried at what had happened. On the other side, I was filming in Romania, and a special effects guy came over from Germany, and we had a lovely German producer. And this man introduced himself, and as he said, my name is Adolf. And we had an Israeli director of photography who said very, very quietly, tell me, do you have a nickname? And he said, yeah, Adi. So this man said, yeah, but we'll call you Adi. But the end of the story is that this man from Germany turned to me, and I was wearing Marvin David, so I don't know where he was looking, said, you know, my father was in the SS, and you can't keep saying sorry forever. And I thought you can say sorry to the end of the world, and it's not going to be long enough. So you've got so many layers. I'm sorry, this isn't a question. I'm just trying to say that, you know, when I worked on something about Sobibor, the different survivors had different attitudes. It's such a complex situation. I mean, thank you so much for the film, because anything that tries to help. I haven't been to Berlin. I was scheduled to go because I very much want to go on the Jewish Walk and the Jewish Museum. But of course we have COVID, but I've been to Munich a lot, and I've worked in different places in Germany. And I have to say, I'm generally sort of okay, but as somebody said in the film, when I see someone who is older,
You think about it.
You can't help but wonder. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Jenny has her hand up as well.
Hi there. Right. I've got a little question. So in the film, there was obviously quite a lot about confronting the guilt of the past, and equally the younger generation. And there are things in the film like the signposts that you have in the whole district, and you can't help but see what happened and get confronted by it. And my question is, did you see what the views are of younger people being constantly confronted by what happened, and the fact that they're acknowledging that it wasn't their fault and they're constantly seeing it?
Some people are tired of it. Yes, that's the big question in Holocaust education. How do you, it's finding the right temperature. It's very complicated. But I don't have an answer.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as both Cheryl, you know, Cheryl's comments and so much that we've heard about today, it's like, this is the whole point. I mean, the best that, you know, you as a filmmaker can do is just capture as many different, you know, perspectives and voices as you can, and leave it for us to make sense of. We're running out of time, and I feel like that's a good place to leave it. You've heard from many people who've appreciated your film. Eva says in the chat here, my grateful thanks to Janina for making this remarkable film. As I mentioned, you know, Eva herself has quite a remarkable story of her own. So high praise there for you, Janina. This has meant so much to
guys for streaming it. Okay, that
well, we can thank UK Jewish Film for streaming it, and to you, of course, for making it in the first place. It's meant so much to our members. This really is very much at the core of the identity of so many members of the AJR, and so I think this is a really popular one. But they would have been very critical of it if you hadn't got it right. They very obviously have not been critical of it at all. You've earned a lot of praise from a tough audience, I think. So well done, well done.
You know, I'm voice it.
You can't see it. You might not be able to see it on your phone, but I just saw applause all across the screen from our members. So with that, I will say thank you, Nina. Thank you for joining us from what looks like a beautiful day in Manhattan. I'm sure you've got more interesting things to be doing as well. And to our members, thanks for joining us. We'll do this again next month. And have a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.